Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode. A topic which I don't think I've ever gone really in depth into it. But the idea of power and pretty much this question, how will the species wield power? And I can see just this one view opening up into many questions. But I would say that my effort for this episode is, while I am alive, to share my comprehension of this, you can say, this concept of power. I have a sort of, not a complete, that means this is definitely one of those topics where a lot of philosophers have spoken about, and so there's a list of opinions in the past, which hopefully in the future one day I will be able to share it with the viewers. A sort of history of power. On some level, when I think about life, it appears to me as a game. And so imagine somebody who, let's say, has played games, let's say video games, and then this person wants to play a video game that is indistinguishable from reality. I find that the closest thing that comes to that video game is the nature of the human mind. Okay, I'm gonna bring my notepad here. I think this is one of those talks where I need to branch it out. Eyes open in a world. And stories begin to have meaning experientially. So I guess first, if I was to open up this idea, let's say that we have one point, and let's call this point the idea of power. Now, I can see the relationship of power to time, and the relationship of time is pretty much how did power behave. let's just for a second think that power was like an animal. And so, what was the behavior of power in the past, the behavior of power in the present, and what will power be in the future? My aim with this episode, and usually with all the episodes, is to fascinate my own self in regards to what I can geometrically extract as potentials of what may happen in the future. You see, in life, as a human being acknowledges the presence of their mind, they realize what comes with their mind is a series of abilities. Every human being that is existing in consciousness, there is something you can do, and something only you can do. And I would say on some level the idea of power is like, the relationship of trying to understand the energy source of life, like where is the power, for living coming from in life, right? And how is power seen, right? Now, here I brought it through the concept of time. Another approach, another line I'll draw here is this concept which you can say this is one of those thoughts that's I feel very proud to have designed, right? For me, I mean, the concepts have been there, but the way I have seen it, pretty much this idea of, I call it Mr.Within's inner and outer realmism, right? And so pretty much I am this person who has this view that there's a world in front of our eyes and there's a world behind our eyes, and this is an incredible way to acknowledge it. The world behind our eyes is equivalent for us noticing that when our eyes are open, light beams enter our eyes and we are seeing something, right? But when we close our eyes, literally our eyelids are closed, how are we able to see something in that mysterious invisible room overlaid on the present called imagination and, let's say, your mind space, right? So to me, I'm like, okay, we have a species here. The species has made strides towards comprehending itself, and now in modern civilization, on some level you can look at civilization, I call it 1.0, or current civilization, so you can look at civilization 1.0 and be like, oh my god, so much insanity, so much ignorance, so much arrogance, so much horror, the horror of the ego in the in 2022. But to me, just like we can see something, in the outer realms we see an inefficiency, the incredible thing about the position of the human mind and its efforts to contemplate how it's even a power to contemplate, to comprehend power. What I'm trying to say is that the civilization 1.0 thinks that we're all human beings in a human world, right? In the world, but what I have realized is that we are actually multidimensional beings, and even though we say we gotta touch it and see it, we gotta we need empirical evidence to believe in it, right? What we don't realize, the one who is believing in the empirical evidence is a subject, and really what kind of intelligence the human organism is this intelligence that has an ability to live behind its eyes before it lives in front of its eyes. And when your mind speeds up, the modern era cluelessly calls it, thinking, but really what it is how attention is recognizing its visibility is in context of invisible, and the only way we can acknowledge the invisible is when we realize there's a context of the inconceivable. So it's pretty much, imagine, like, I'll tell you my story. Pretty much I was this human being where it's like, imagine seeing like cartoons as a kid of like heroes, like having the hero archetype, the warrior archetype, like the great archetype, great person archetype, right? And it was as if like I wanted to reach like the peak of this mountain called knowledge, right? This wasn't always there in me, but some part of me was curious to know what the world knows so far, right? And so I would say I ran in my own way, as if like, imagine understanding, let's call this, there's something on this planet known as real understanding, or pure reality, pure understanding of reality. Imagine it's like a peak of a mountain, and every human being, whether they call themselves a philosopher or not, we are all swimming through the unknown waters of manifestation as a conscious entity. And so what I'm trying to say is I tried climbing this mountain of knowledge, and there was a point where I realized, like, how would I say it? I went in on my own search, right? Imagine there's some hunters back in the day. Imagine like hunter-gatherers, right? So imagine there's this human tribe, and there was a bunch of hunters. Now imagine there's a group of the hunters that will go together to go and hunt like a buffalo, right? And imagine now there is one hunter who is going alone. And so I thought, how can I mean, this is just, I'm being poetic, I'm using this language, but I thought, what is the greatest treasure, or what is the major understanding of the world that if I hunt it down, if I find it, like, it would be an absolutization of the state of knowledge, right? And, I came to this very fascinating conclusion that the one who is holding the knowledge, the ego, I noticed it's invisibly here. What I'm trying to say is that it's like you're trying to be somebody. Imagine, somebody climbing a mountain, and midway as he's climbing the mountain, he realizes there is no mountain, and the whole journey has begun at the peak of the mountain. Pretty much I realized that people have tried to use ideological systems to explain how they're experiencing an unknown world, not realizing it's an unknown world. That means there's a very bizarre possibility, very incredibly fascinating, mystical possibility that truth is the unknown, right? People may be like, Mr. Within, if truth's the unknown, how do we know it's true? And I'll be like, beyond, a species that woke up on a rock in the middle of nowhere and began naming everything. Like, that's what's happened. Evolution is another way of, an object becoming a subject. That is really where evolution has led, Materialists hold evolution in the greatest view, it's like we have evolved, and we're sophisticated objects, and we're these sophisticated animals, but we're not realizing that the sophistication of our mind could be independent to our existence, to our biological existence. What I'm trying to say is, the great mystery reveals itself during the lifetime, and then the honesty of all your lifetimes finds you, right? It's like somebody, imagine, somebody's in the middle of a soccer game, and for a second they're like, I'm not a soccer player, I'm a free soul, and and the goalkeeper starts running to go do a bicycle kick goal, And the defenders have to like use their heads as hands when the goalie's not there. I'm trying to say that the unknown is something very important, and the moment we realize it, our association with ideological knowledge changes. And when a person, let's say mystically speaking, when you meet the unknown, that's when you realize you're meeting a moment that its value is there before you can know its value. It's as if like it's the poetry of like, in order to access a known world, we needed a known self. And so in order to access an unknown world, you need to get acquainted with your unknown self. And what the unknown self is the instantaneity of attention and existence. Pretty much it's like the viewer and the viewed and their simultaneity. So to make this simple, I call this pretty much the inner realms and the outer realms. And to me, this is an incredible way. I will speak, in this context of inner realm and outer realm, and probably till the rest of my life. Why? Because it is the cure for all, I would say a majority, maybe like 70% of psychological problems on the planet are happening because the human being is not realizing it's in 2 dimensions rather than just one. And because it doesn't realize it's in 2 dimensions and just wants to be in 1 dimension, chaos and order loop endlessly. Oh my God, we have, chat section coming. Activity, So welcome everyone. Somebody says, is there a way to get rid of the background noise? I'll turn it down. So, welcome everyone. If there's any questions, about the, content, it's welcomed. But anyways, just keep in mind, whoever you're listening, Aristotle has this quote. He says, it's the sign of an educated mind to entertain an idea without accepting it. Most people, because they function on an emotional level, when they see a new idea, they think understanding means they have to accept it in contrast to their memories, or they have to reject it, right? But I'll get into, certain ideas I have learned from, watching pretty much like a 10-minute video about Michel Foucault, this French philosopher, and he has theories on power. But he, in his book, The Order of Things, he has this thing where he says, when it comes to human psychology, there is a pattern of resemblance going on. And so really human beings, in order to be emotionally content, they filter their ideological landscapes. Let me see how else I can say this. Okay, I'll get to this later. And if I don't, the chat section can remind me. But pretty much, familiarity is a huge gear in how the mechanism of consciousness becomes an activity. It's like some part of our, it's like the brain is tunneling through versions of itself, And because we don't notice this, or we choose not to notice this, it's kind of like saying, like, okay, let's say you sat down for 10 to 20 minutes, or let's say somebody just sat down, okay? Imagine you were cooking pasta, and you just sat down. Let's say you turned off the stove and you sat down in the kitchen. cross-legged like a Buddha. Okay. And the reason I'm telling people to sit down on the ground is because there's a humbling factor about it. The idea is that we think we are our thoughts, and the issue with this is that when a person just sits down and is still, just for a second still and silent, they notice thoughts are coming and going. It's not like behind our eyes, it's like thoughts are a mask we wear. It's thoughts come and go. It's pretty much like behind our eyes we are viewing this space where imagery can move in ways that it cannot move in the outer realms. So pretty much your mind gives you an ability to move reality in ways that are not permissible in reality. This is really the power of imagination, to see the other side. Like a good person who has let's say has a care to even wonder about what imagination is, that person will imagine the bad, to have a contrast for good. That person who is evil, let's say, they have to believe in good first to even be evil, right? I'm not talking about animalistic unconsciousness, because there is a level to violence that it doesn't have a mind, and then there's like violence where there is a mind, but the mind is ignoring its universal responsibility. But anyways, I'll go back to this. And sorry for the extra noise, guys. My neighbors are having, a good time. So but anyways, pretty much in this picture I've drawn, you see this circle. That circle is the idea of power. And so far, I'm like, okay, how can I look at the idea of power? I can see it through time. I can see it in regards to how is it in the past, how is it in the present, how will it be in the future. And then another way I can see the concept of power in dividing the dimensions of the moment into, okay, there's my inner realm, which is how my mind is moving my body, and there's my outer realm, which is how the pretty much body is moving the mind or projecting the mind, right? So that's one way. Another way I should come to power is really in regards to, I guess, structures in regards to society. It's inevitable to disconnect the idea of power from the concept of war, and also the concept of economy, which could be, reasons for war. Right? It's as if many people don't know this, but it's like power is not per se just something a person can have. Actually, in a still moment, there is no power. Power is an action. Power is like a verb, right? Even though we're acknowledging it like a noun, right? But it's as if until the person does anything, there is like, what power was seen? It's like it's something that's activated, right? Or it's an ability. So when it comes to power and pretty much what is the human mind's approach to understanding the world, it looks at it from a singular perspective, it looks at it from a void perspective, and when it's content with both of those states, it looks at it from a dualistic perspective. When the mind has played enough simulations of itself, which is oscillating between chaos and order and duality, and God, my MacBook's gonna go to the spirit drum quick, guys. I gotta get a charger. Hold on. it's one of those save your laptop moments, Okay. So guys, I connected, my laptop to the Fountain of Youth. And where I was going with the idea of power was in its structure. And in its structure, I would say this is where it divides into, like, let's say, the simple duality of the individual and the collective. This is another branch of how we can see power. So there's the idea of individual power, the power of one man, like, Superman's like weightlifting ability. And then we have not like a Superman, but we have a super species. An advanced species in my terminology specifically. So there's an individual dimension. We could look at the idea of power and be like, okay, what does power mean for an individual? What does power mean for a collective? Let's say you're an efficient human being, but you're in an inefficient world, It's as if you will, in your personal dimensions, feel powerful, but in your impersonal dimensions, feel as if, the civilization never acknowledged you. Right, when I talk about an advanced civilization, its governing structure, its original system has an incredible awareness that every human being is a unique advantage of perception in the world. So there's the notion of individual and collective. And I would say when it comes to, especially I'm someone who I engage a lot of mystical topics, so I would have to say when it comes to what the worlds of power, so I would say it maybe here, just to make everybody happy, I'm going to bring it in the sense of free will, the power of the free will, and the power of, if you're religious, it would be divine, I guess. Free will or nature's will. That's for those who are secular, and divine will for those who are, let's say, have a theological perspective. It's kind of fascinating, the world we live in, right? Even though we're all physically in like one giant elemental multiplayer, like online game or online map, right? It's like we're all in this video game called existence. And at the same time, like the way our minds engage existence is through the journey of their own experience. This is why listening becomes really powerful, because listening is the only way one can bypass the conditioning of their ethnocentrism. It's like the past was like snapshots of stories, right? When I try to remember myself, remember my memories, of my earlier, who I was earlier. I come to moments where it was like an actuality. Right, that means it's like, I think, a good question, to be like, when somebody remembers, are they remembering like verbs, or are they remembering nouns? So I guess that could be another branch. The concept of power as a concept being a citizen of language. Is it a verb? Is it a noun? Can you imagine, imagine the world's waiting for this great scholar to be like, what is power? And the great scholar's like, it's a verb. And we're like, that's it, it's like, that's it. So technically, power as a memory, in order for it to be a noun, I guess it has to either be direct experiential power, or it has to be belief in a memory. something incredible about this world is that we are designed to journey through it. This is something they don't say, you know. It's like children are not raised having a sense that life is an adventure. They just feel it's a system, right? It's just some system. All right, what do we do? You know. But if like, it's like, how can we get a species fascinated fascinated in its own advancement? You know, to me, there was a fascination with like the concept of divinity, with the concept of, I would say, the divine will. When I was younger, I would experience moments where I was like, is something else moving behind the scenes? What is the possibility of my eyes finding moments like this, right? It's as if the person wondering what knows that there is a placebo effect, for example. It's as if at some point you realize there's something unknown here, and its ability of functioning as an unknown presence rather than a known personality. It's a huge shift. Like, our species is pretty much ever since opening its eyes, every great event in the realm has been like another type of freak out, right? So to me, when I look at it, I'm like, okay, 8 billion creatures on a rock opened their eyes, noticed like what can we even believe about a world that's just being here? You know, it's like can you imagine, like, you know, like it's like, you know, scholars suddenly figured out what like the first reaction of the first psychological reaction was, you know. First evolutionary psychological reaction, you know. I think the first thing was like, you know, when consciousness activated, when our minds began knowing they are here. It was another way of saying the attention's like, whoa, am I existing right now? So anyways, I'll come back to the idea of power. I should concentrate here. And by the way, the viewers are welcome to treat the chat section as a battlefield and also challenge me if they'd like to. You know, there is no, when it comes to, like, my ultimate perspective is that when it comes to truth, my acknowledgement is that it's beyond language. So when I speak, I am playful usually with language, because it's like, I know it's not the full picture, you know? Because if language was the full picture, poets wouldn't exist, you know? There would be no trying to extract, you know, the beyond from where we are, you know? It's like, the things I would say, let me see, if I was to, for a second, you know, slow down the analysis and just tell the viewers, alright, you know, I'm trying to think, like, imagine, sometimes when I want to answer questions, guys, I wouldn't recommend this, but this is something I do in my inner realms. I imagine, like, a meteor is about to hit Earth, and I have, like, you know, like 2 minutes to, like, answer a question. In your inner realms, you can motivate yourself by extracting emotions from probabilities of the realm. The mind, you know, this may not be the best word to use, but the mind is cloning the outer realms and the inner realms, but using free will to change it, right? That means I can, like, close my eyes and imagine myself flying. I mean, like, I could imagine myself flying, right? But it doesn't mean I'm actually flying in the outer realms. But it does give me a probable experience. It's as if, like, imagine the Wright brothers, when they were kids, they saw birds, right? And somebody came to the Wright brothers, you know, let's say when they were young, it's like, hey kids, what do you want to be? You know, and their father's standing there. It's like, all right, kids, give a good answer, make me proud. And so imagine the Wright brothers are like, we want to be birds, you know, and the friend of the father of the Wright brothers, it's like, all right, kids, okay. But little, you know, did that person know they were actually the first human beings to become birds, you know. flight is part of the definition of a bird, you know. So anything that flies, you know, on some level. Reality, based on the ability of the mind, it's kind of like where it's like just like how I don't know, anybody who's driven a car before, just like that feeling you have with like your foot being on the gas pedal and you being able to in one instant increase the speed and in one instant reduce the speed, right? It's like I have the same feeling when it comes to my mind, you know, that there has always been a dimension where this unknown viewer is looking at like the content of the moment, right? And its effort, it amplifies, its effort gives speed, right? To me, power, I had this feeling that they're like physical power because I was raised in a theocratical society when I was young. I was born in Iran. And I noticed that like it was as if how could people be comfortable with a dictatorship? Because ultimately everything's under a celestial dictatorship, right? What I'm trying to say is that for a religious person, it's like God is the power authority of the outer realms, right? That means it's as if like technically God is like the first political structure placed on the mind. It's an incredible moment in history. It's when politics, language, and the unknown beauty of the realm, you know, meshed into this concept, infused into this concept, God. You know, it's as if there were kings and then somebody wondered who is the king of the cosmos, right? And it's like whose kingdom is manifestation, right? Because people think religion is just like, so you're imagining some person sitting on a throne on the clouds, but in reality, it's the mystery of what is the nature of the original dimension where all manifestation has arose. Can the human being even access it? To me, there has been a power which, let's say, its output that in some sense pours out of the filter of the ego, right? There has been moments in my life where, like, I would say, you know, compared to the people I've played chess around me, I think I'm a decent chess player, and but compared to like grandmasters, I'm like, you know, nothing, maybe. But I'm saying in regards to just, how would I tell you? Just like that feeling I've had where I've seen like a checkmate before like the other person has. It's kind of like this evolutionary hunter feeling, you know. I felt a sort of power in knowing the future and flowing to its outcome, right? I have experienced that. There's been moments where there was once where, I mean, I remember this was after I had started the talks. These talks were, you know, they were born in 2014. And I remember my mind was in like this sort of poetic, like, you know, rhythm. And I remember I got into an argument with someone close to me, and I didn't have a filter. Normally I try to, you know, how would I say it? It's like I use silence as an Iron Man suit for my true identity, simply because, how would I say it? I have this Taoistic approach where the less I do, the more I get to see what the world does. And that becomes instant information for me, right? in certain scenarios, right? But the example I was saying about, like, winning in chess or something, is that it was a power of ego. It was pretty much like ability being proven to its source, right? So there is a power. Let's say, somebody, like, punches a brick, there's these Shaolin monks that are like, I don't know, they punch a brick and the house next door gets destroyed, I'm exaggerating their power, but pretty much, like, there's a demonstration of ability. Pretty much it's like, imagine if life has this video game archetypal context. It's another way of saying life is a performance. And everybody who is alive in every moment that you're in the conscious waking state, they say in traditional thought that there's the conscious waking state, there's the dream state, deep sleep state, and we cycle through these. So it's like in the conscious waking state, we are performers, because that's what life is. Life is a dynamism, It's like you can't, put a poster on life and think that poster is the ultimate truth. Life was moving before language could become it. Or before language could become its meaning. There is a simplicity to this plane of existence we're in, whoever you are hearing me now. Like another filter, another branch I could have drawn here. It's just like simplicity and complexity. There is a simple way that life is being before any of us need to do anything, that if we have the ability to effortlessly appreciate how existence is being its own effort. Imagine you were an eternal being and your essence was made of love, just pure love, okay? And this eternal being, its essence made of pure love, suddenly noticed consciousness emerging as a temporary being. That means imagine, there were eternity was guarding the temporary. That means imagine it's like the person didn't just have poetically angels watching over them, but they had a sort of, you can say eternity watches over the temporary. That's pretty much the idea I'm trying to say. Or if you're super religious hearing me, it's pretty much the inconceivable is watching over the conceivable. And the question of why is it doing this? Love has been the only explanation of why the divine has to interact with the human being. That means if there is a possibility of some sort of interdimensional force, it has been like it's as if like what a divine intervention is like in a horizontal universe suddenly a vertical line was drawn. A vertical universe appeared. I think the idea of power ultimately comes down to a person's image, or I shouldn't say image, it comes down to one's original value. A person can be conditioned in this life to feel that their original value is zero, right? Let's say, there's someone who is just zero. Their value in existence is zero. I shouldn't say zero, but I should say like when I say zero, that means imagine there's in an advanced civilization, there's a human archetype, or before an advanced civilization, technically. But I would say imagine somebody who they look at this world and they're like, okay, the world is nothing and I am nothing, so everything's nothing and even nothing is nothing. right? So the person, that's one way, one state of mind, where it's as if the ego is released from all its desires, because it's noticed everything is nothing, you know. Another way, another value of the original value could be, in some sense, that's, I would say, the one dimension. So this is where a human being, their mind strategy is pretty much like, okay, how do I deal with this messed up world and suffering and all these galaxies that we can't, you know, all these countless galaxies and possibilities of manifestation, what do we do? And so this is where the person, first they were convinced by nothing, and now it's the flip side, you know, it's where the person, you think, the way they resolve, that it's like their emotional life concludes that everything is one moment. Do you know? I don't know how to say this, but it's like, I have experienced in my own way moments where I was like, no way, I don't even exist. I am neither my body, I am neither my thoughts, because both of these have been changing in the space-time continuum. I can't even be the world, because the world is changing. How do I even know what world was there before it changed? You know? So it's, in some sense, it's like existence is strange. It simulates through our eyes and senses, like sensory perception shows us a stable world, shows us this landscape. Okay, guys, some, you know, next level comments in the chat section. Somebody in the chat section says language fails to describe the divine order in much the same way two lovers may not be able to communicate their issues of strife. By the very nature of the case, words are limiting. Love comes from the realization that we're all things and all things are us, divine identity, which equals the motivation to love all beings. Without that, universal love doesn't make sense. Okay, so that point, you know, that point, this comment, so that's exactly what I mean. That means the person concludes truth to be everything, and when it's everything, of suffering, individual suffering is not our suffering. Do you know? I don't know how to say it, but I'm trying to say that's when you have used one moment to capture all moments, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but what I am saying is that there is other ways the world can move, that our emotions cannot convince us, that our thoughts cannot convince us, that it's just we have been staring at the unknown from the beginning. That is the realization of the nature of the mind. And to be content with the mind, imagine, like, so technically what I'm saying, I'm like this podcaster saying, like, the mind is unknown and you gotta accept that unknown nature, right? But in actuality, the only way you can accept it is that if you were unknown from the beginning too, right? It's as if, like, existence was the mask that experience was wearing, and experience is the mask that the unknown was wearing. And the unknown couldn't wear a mask. It's like there was no need, you know? Right now, civilization is still in duality. People think they're suffering in 2022. No way. This is like still a blessing. Right now, we're like a natural being that is experiencing a psychological dualism in, let's say, civilization, the concrete jungle. Right now, it's still good. In the future, cyberspace will have a huger, bigger presence in history, and there will come psychological modes of humanism we have never witnessed before, right? You know, it's like, let me say it this way. The concept of power, or the search for power, that journey dissolved into, whoa, the unknown. There's unknown variables to consciousness. There's ways that life is happening that our species hasn't even discovered to explain. Do you know? Right now, the educational systems, instead of creating armies of advanced explorers wondering about everything in this universe, all dimensions of this world, right? Instead, the educational systems are like, okay, memorize what the past said, because you're going to go into the present and realize you're unprepared, right? That means some educational systems do prepare you, but some educational systems show how unprepared you are. Do you know? Like that, this is what I'm saying, is that instead of students and teachers, we're all explorers, and we forgot we were. You know, there would just be a massive rank in an advanced civilization. The educational system would have an incredible ranking system, right? And its ranking system would be like an explorer and its level. So imagine somebody in an advanced civilization in the future is like a level 3033 of like, you know, of let's say, you know, exploration. They're like a level 3000 explorer, right? And there would come honor and sophistication with this, right? The biggest issue with the world is that it has forgotten that it could have always discriminated between what is actually moving the moment and where the outer realms and inner realms divide the moment. Right now, I'm going to share an exercise, and I don't know, anybody who's listening, maybe try this out. I want you to find an object in front of you. Any object, let's say your phone, your laptop, whatever. Right now in front of me, I see my laptop. So it's like, look at your laptop and then close your eyes, but keep looking at your laptop. And you will notice that the moment you do this, at first there's a sort of shakiness, as if somebody is like just putting their foot in the water of a swimming pool. Do you know? Like, it's like, do you see what I'm saying? The initial ripples are how, like, we think that we can't see when our eyes are closed. And imagine you become very comfortable with seeing through your eyes being closed. That at some point, like when you close your eyes and see that object, you can open your eyes, and the discrimination between whether your eyes are closed or not doesn't change how imagination is present. Think of it this way. We're 8 billion DNAs that have never existed before. Everybody is like an instrument that has never existed, and the task of the lifetime is that is the greatest effort, is the greatest melody going to be heard. I mean, seriously, guys, I have thought about reality, and I have thought about its evolution, and I have realized either the species uses its collective consciousness, or it feels it doesn't deserve. Right? Something that I'm seeing is that life is such a rare opportunity to just be an existential creature, that why aren't people supremely fascinated by the world and yet dulled down? And I realized is that there was a benefit that was in living in nature that we didn't have when we started living in cities. When urbanization happened, a different type of natural mind began developing. Do you know? We're technically like, you know, it's like we use technology to turn ourselves into aliens in contrast to lesser species, right? You know, imagine, you know, there's, okay, I'll move on from this. I don't know, on some level, I have felt that there's something I've termed it a decency resonance, in every moment, a person can look at anything and have multiple emotions on it, right? Especially when you begin probabilizing things in the future, you're going to have emotions. For me, I thought about sometimes I think like what would the conquerors or how would the conquerors archetype approach reality? Like imagine this archetype I set up an explorer. It was as if consciousness was conquering non-conscious and knowledge was like the walls of its kingdom. And we're like this biological program that has suddenly become conscious of itself and is reestablishing relationships of how existence is being experienced and how experience is just existing. For me, I have asked myself, like, why is there a mind here? And why is there even a soul here? Or why is there even consciousness here? And why is there even anything to see anything, right? And I noticed that prior to language, which exists through duality, through the lens of duality, the meaning of the world was instantaneous. It's like, what do you do when you've experienced everything being everything? All those people who talk about oneness, they realize how incredibly dehumanized oneness is. That means oneness is like equivalent to like, pretty much it's a non-human psychological experience. And the best way to say is that it's a mystical experience. It's another way of saying, imagine in the future people have the opportunity to exist as an individual entity, or they could feel like they're waves in an ocean. So, let's say that there are seven oceans, right, to the world. Arctic, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, North Pacific, South Pacific, Indian, and South Oceans, South Oceans. Now imagine, this is a prediction I'm making, I think 200 years from now, I get that kind of feeling, that 200 years from now, there's going to be discovery of an 8th ocean. And this 8th ocean would be collective consciousness, and it would technically be like those beings who want to experience beyond just being a biological entity. So I'll give you an example. Imagine human lifespan wasn't 100 years. Imagine the human lifespan was like 10,000 years. Imagine 10,000 years was the norm. Okay, every human being lived 10,000 years. And so imagine in that 10,000 year lifetime, imagine the person had experienced technically an immortality. Right, 10,000 years is enough to feel like an immortal, right? And imagine there was advanced technology, and advanced technology kept people youthful, right? That means the fountain of youth was somehow technologically discovered. Think of like movie Elysium technology. So this ocean would be the ocean of human minds. And right now, we are boats that haven't even entered this ocean. In 200 years from now, I think the fascination of psychologists is going to be like, okay, what would our minds be like when they are all in one space? Right? The cool thing about having a body is that two people can't walk through each other. Do you know? Do you know what I'm saying? Like the body is its own occupant of the space-time continuum in the conscious waking state. I think that if I was to take this info more from my experience, I would say there's a power in the inner realms I've had, and there's a power in the outer realms. And I've noticed that this power is not specific to just the location it is found in, right? Whether it's in front of our eyes or behind our eyes. It's just that where attention goes. Often in these talks, I use pretty much when I look at human beings on the planet, I just see them as advanced communicators or pilots of consciousness. Pilots of consciousness are those human beings, technically futurists, who are carrying where the spaceship Earth is going, as Buckminster Fuller and Marshall McLuhan, have beautifully mentioned. It's like technically we're all on a spaceship, but we're like on the outside of it. That means imagine you had 8 billion crew members living on the outside of a spaceship, right? But the spaceship was a planet, and its driver was like, the forces of nature moving it. Maybe imagine a legend is born that the Earth can be driven, right? And it's like when all the human beings on the planet are in unity, or if the most conscious species finds its universal responsibility, imagine it could summon me. An immortal being would be very open to experiencing a non-physical collective state of consciousness, right? And it's just because our lifespans are short that we fear technology, right? The power of the mind is that you could see anything and you could literally wonder about its opposite. That's the beautiful thing about duality, right? Where it's as if any chaotic thing you see has an ordered counterpart. Every ordered thing you see has a chaotic counterpart. That means if you're someone right now thinking that I am such a good person, like, believe it or not, your subconscious has to have a concept of like a bad person. So the idea becomes active. It's like a good person wondering, why do I never catch a break? Why? Because you have turned the world. You have allowed good and evil to move your mind prior to wondering what is here in the first place. Right now, it's all to me just survival strategy, right? It's like 8 billion conscious minds. No way, we're in the middle of nowhere. What do? Let's use language to recreate the world. And just like our ancestors, let's say they just smashed rocks together and sparks flew and fire was made, which seems like it needs to be an intent. I actually think fire was discovered, initially by like lightning burning a tree and a tree branch falling and a caveman picking it up and not realizing what heat is and just throwing it in a bush and like all the other cavemen picking it up. When we, discover our fears, like when we try to become conscious of our fears, we discover the limits of our power. Every person's weakness is what the reality their mind cannot enter, right? And, they don't say this often, but it's like at some point in the middle of this unknown movement that we're calling life, it's honestly an unknown movement. If we were to be like true human beings and be like, okay, nobody knows. Why? Because it's bigger than the knowledge of one mind. I think the purpose of life existentially is already complete. If you wanted an existential purpose to this life, you'll be like, okay, I already exist. Everybody has achieved an existential purpose just by occupying as an element, as the periodic table's unique organization. It's like we're a universe, communicating. Like there's something incredible there. It's like the ability for nothing to move into becoming everything. It's like what true divinity is realizing the edges of your eyes and how you can walk and see beyond that edge. There's this story. This is, I think, the secret algorithm that will save humanity and the minds of human beings. Is that, I would say, here, I'll say this, I think all human psychological problems, I'll make this kind of claim now, all human psychological problems will be solved the moment greatness is connected to the context of the human being. It's like we have forgotten that the mind has the same permission to see something as weak as strong. They say one man's trash is another man's treasure, one man's treasure is another man's trash. What is that? It's like human beings looking at objects and valuing it in accordance to what their intelligence desires. Right? And what is desire? The past trying to continue into the future. It's the mind leaping for an inner realm possibility, Alone in a cosmos, eyes open. Eyes that realized everything in their view could be them. And so, when attention and existence are accepted, when a human being realizes their search for freedom is not an external journey, it's that the mind advances, evolves, or pretty much the mind levels up when its context expands. Power is the freedom your mind gives you. For Napoleon, for example, somebody told him, he said, I want to be emperor. Somebody was like, that's impossible. And Napoleon was like, impossible is a word in a fool's dictionary, right? And that person was like, still, it's impossible, man. There's already an emperor. The beautiful thing about this world is how alive it is. And consciousness, through piloting its attention, many value systems can just be recreated. Pretty much what I'm doing with these podcasts really is in every moment attempting to wonder about what it all means again. Let me see if I can draw out my own ascension from my psychology into, right now I've concluded, I'm a pretty much inconceivable witness of an invisible mind moving a visible body. And the mind is a field, the body is a particle in it, and what is aware of both of them simultaneously has to be inconceivable, because it's another way of saying, like, who is watching the world? Really, the reason human beings have minds is to open up worlds And this idea of human beings thinking they are creating, in reality, it's at pretty much our minds are, it's pretty much like imagine a dolphin jumping out of the water and going back into the water and telling everybody there's something else. There is an inner life that is happening that is irrelevant to any object. And there is an outer life happening, which is pretty much like how an object lived in the lifetime, right? But one's inner life, its true fascination, comes to the contentment found through the spectrum of emotions accepted. You know, imagine you're somebody who has this vision that the future generations may suffer and something tragic may happen. It's as if, you know, you may be having the best day, but it's like, how can you? Some part of, you know, it's like, it's just pretty much the testament of advancement in ability, where human beings like, okay, I was capable in, you know, utilizing the past. I was capable in being, let's say, utilizing the present, and now the only thing left to live for is the future. The future is where freedom is. You know, mystical traditions think it's in the present because they dehumanize. But I am saying civilization is a grand, how can I tell you, it's like the most honorable thing. A species that was so savage where it was like human beings without even talking would kill each other. We have come a far way. You know, it's like somebody basking in the sunlight and somebody basking in the potential of like a species. It's all about how attention is utilized. I'm telling you, life is how attention moves, really. It's like, what greater sacredness can a person find, you know? If somebody said, Mr.Within, where do all ideas come from? I would say all ideas are like actors that can only be seen when you realize there's a spotlight in the room. To truly discover one's nature of mind means that it's like you have to fly beyond the clouds of imagination. That means that pretty much this is the option. We started from a dehumanized state. The child didn't know it had a name and didn't know it will have a personality. Then the child enters a humanized state. It lives in civilization, but ultimately what physical death means is a sort of dehumanization in the outer realms. And in some sense, you know, for the psyche, it could mean the person chooses to be dehumanized when they body dehumanized. They could choose to be humanized when their body is dehumanized, right? So what I'm trying to say pretty much is that we shouldn't fear our fears. We should strategically use them. We should strategically wield. It's as if like right now the concept of power, we're like, no man should have, you know, that much power. Like, you know, we have that kind of view. But what if we had everybody having ultimate power? That means an advanced civilization was pretty much thinking like, okay, how do we get the most advanced biological existence on this planet? And how do we get the most advanced psychological existence? And how do we reach a level of advancement where the human mind is too smart to suffer? It has noticed the importance of the future to allow the past to become its tears. The future is like this great event that is happening, and we're all in like the training zone, you know? Earth is like training before attention enters an unknown dimension, you know? Or poetically, Earth is like the airport, you know, before the consciousness or the attention or the initial energetic attention. It's pretty much, we shouldn't fear the unknown. We should understand it by realizing it's a presence. The unknown is more like a quality of being. I don't know, it's just this feeling I have that human beings think that power is something they have to get in the outer realms. But in actuality, after they have gotten the power in the outer realms, they're going to wonder about true power, which is an inner realm thing. When I say true power is an inner realm thing, that means just like a person has their free will can move their hands in the air, similarly, the free will, a person can close their eyes and their attention can move in the abstraction that the mind provides. So you can live in your mind. You can live in your mind. True thinking eventually becomes a sort of concentration, where this is where I would explain trance states from a mystical context. So in certain spiritualistic traditions, spirituality was always kind of like, the stranger in the room. It was on some level, I would say, like, here I'll share a story from that comes from a Sufi dervish tradition, and it's an ancient story, right? So in this story, there's like this village and there's this marketplace, and there's this kid who is like, you could say he's like an alchemist, or he's like somebody who has embraced, let's say, who has become conscious of, let's say, the deeper dimensions of life, right? And in the middle of the market, this kid has gone there, and there's a bunch of wise people there too, right? Like older generations too. And so this kid just is arguing with this old man. And this old man, who seems to be like supremely enlightened in the story, he's arguing with this old man, and he says, nobody can die, nobody can choose their death, just like they didn't choose their birth, nobody can choose their death, right? Nobody can consciously leave. And he's not saying like, let's say like suicide and shit like that. He's saying like your consciousness you can't, like, he's pretty much saying your attention, your consciousness can't leave your body. Right, it's another way of saying something like that, right? So in this Sufi story, this kid is saying nobody can control, right? That nobody's soul can just, leave this world. It's God's will, something along these lines. And then there's this enlightened old man says, yes, you can. As if samsara was never samsara, as if the world was never a problematic outcome. It was never a problem. Imagine you for a moment look at all the suffering you've had in this lifetime and realize it could have never been a problem. It's like how attention chose to carry what it saw. The might of our eyes is in the recognition of the vision beyond. The old man in the story, he has one of these he has one of these cylindrical hats, and just like you would place like a rake against the wall, this old man just puts the hat beside his ear, just smiles and says goodbye to everybody. And he says goodbye to this kid, and he says, all right, I'm leaving. And he closes his eyes, and he, technically the yogic term for it would be he mahasamadhis. His consciousness ascends beyond the limitations that the body put for the identity. So it's another way of saying that person freed themselves before the body could die. That's what it means. When you free yourself before the body dies, it's another way of saying the mind has nothing to fear because its essence is of the nature of nothing. It's as if this whole time we have not been a soul in matter, we have been the soul of space. And we have forgotten this. The mind is a field. The mind is like every person's imagination is like the royal palace that only their eyes are privileged to enter. Do you know? And if a person realizes what honor means, is that the outcome, the evolution of the truth of the outer ones. It's as if, you know what it is, on some level, sure, I have my own personality, flaws and whatnot. It's like I'm limited to my own, let's say individual persona, but at the same time, I have this feeling that I am participating in the most incredible moment in history. Just the fact that we're all alive. Literally, we are being history live streamed right now as a species. And so it's as if when people realize, first thing, that the world is just like in the middle of nowhere, we named everything on a rock floating in the middle of nowhere, right? And then they in some sense realize that now that we have named everything, we can use our intelligence. Imagine you're a human being and you're like, okay, I have one lifetime to wonder about what is the most advanced ultimate state of being. Regardless of what spiritual people say, religious people say, secular people say, let's just say that hidden legend, the legend of that hidden treasured state of being was there. Right? That there is right now, just like if everybody was a Rubik's Cube, there is a state they could be in where the Rubik's Cube is already complete. And that's like the legend of human psychology, and its origin. There's a book it's unpublished, but it's called The Source of Language, where I just, roared out these essays. I'm saying that a species that has been identifying with an object and with a mysterious subject moving the object is coming to realize that because the world is a multidimensional place, the access of human intelligence is multidimensional by nature. Just in our biological design, we're multidimensional. We have ears, a nose, eyes. You see, like the biological system is strangely very symmetrical, and simultaneously it comes in like pairs. Right, it's like two eyes being the same sight, right? So there is, what I'm trying to say is like pretty much, let's say any being in any type of existence where there was consciousness, in wondering about the true nature of consciousness, starts off with an original acceptance of the structure of the realm. To me, it's like if I don't see the geometry of what I want to say before, I can't say it. To me, there's an incredible geometrical level to life. That means imagine everything you have seen has been, like simultaneously is at a geometric dimension. Just like a geometrical value, it's like saying energy is made of geometry. I should 100% give a talk on that. You heard it here, folks. Energy is made of geometry. pretty much there's a point of attention. Consciousness, or like the experience of existence, is a singular event. This singular event, how would I? Okay. Let's say we have the concept of power. The concept of power goes to the human being. And the concept of the human goes to the concept of the mind. So we're like, okay, what is power? We realize a human being is requiring that concept, is acknowledging that concept. So we need to be humans before we have the concept of power or can recognize power. In order to be a human, we need a conscious mind. Now, in order to have a conscious mind, we needed a world. And in order to need it, before we could need a world, we needed space. And the issue with space is that it's inconceivable to some degree. That means a person can fear emptiness, and a person can fear God, and it's the same thing. It's fearing the inconceivable. And space comes back to consciousness. So if I was to draw this out, this is not a good picture of a person. So we have this is being the eyes of the person, and we have something like this. This is the inner realm. Sorry, this is the outer realms. This is the inner realms. And in some sense, it's pretty much information comes from outside and then comes out this way. It's honestly like sensory perception is the movement. It's like the world moves into our eyes, and then that world that has entered our eyes becomes part of the system of the human being, updates the system, and we reanimate again. For me, I thought like the only great approach, I think, is that we, instead of thinking the human being has to do something specific, we think of civilization having what I call the advanced principle. That means, imagine the advanced principle means in any moment of life, a person can wonder about what the most advanced probability would be. That means right now, me giving this talk, I can wonder about what would the most advanced way of me giving this talk would be. But what would the most advanced state of activity be? And it comes to the acknowledgement of a visible dimension where objects are found, an invisible dimension where subjects are masquerading as events, as pretty much the mind is like a free cinema, you know, and when you can see your memories or you can visualize things, right, that's like the mind's free cinema, free tickets to the cinema, you know. So when you discover the nature of your inner realms, my first recommendation to viewers is that you have to honor it by being your most honest self. That's the thing about like society. You don't have to. But right now, civilization 1.0, the world is the outer realms are psychologically so artificial that it's easy for people to be dishonest because the context allows it, right? But when it comes to the mysteries of the realm, when it comes to the shamanic vision, when it comes to every holy man's stare beyond the sky. Where is the edge of the freedom of our eyes? Consciousness is a moment of being. That means simultaneously as we're being a body, and there's a brain communicating. It's like literally a candle, and we're not considering the glow of the candle as part of the candle. The mind is part of. It's like the extension of the body in another dimension. I find that I was asking this question for myself where I was like, okay, what is so unique about the human species that it could have a completely different purpose than any other species? And I realized because we're the most advanced species on this planet, which is an achievement on its own and a blessing on its own. It's like we're blessed to be like the most advanced species on our planet where like lions are not trying to break into Congress, or like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like animal life is like pretty much we are superior. Our minds are more alpha than the angriest wolf growl. Do you know what I'm saying? The mind has an ability to be like poetically light years ahead of the body, right? It just depends on your nature, right? As a human being. If you're an emotional person, your imagination would be in a sort of drunken master style. If it was a sort of martial art, right? The mind, it's pretty much, when I look at human beings, I ask myself, this human being, have they acknowledged that there's emptiness? Have they acknowledged that everything is just existing in a singular way? Have they acknowledged that the mind is projecting the dualism of the endless dance of chaos and order, right? And then I ask myself, has duality wondered about the infinity beyond? And infinity is the evolution of the dualistic mind, and the evolution of the infinite is technically to back to the inconceivable. In Vedic thought, they took this so far that they felt existence was God's dream. That means God, like Krishna, I don't know if it was Krishna or Brahman, I think it was Brahman, where it's like one God was dreaming, like 3 days of one God like sleeping and dreaming was equivalent to like, I don't know, like a ridiculous number of like 64 million years of human like life. Right? Like that's an intense metaphysical system to have, It's like God's dreaming and we're the imagination of God right now, Where it's like existence is the imagination of the inconceivable. That's pretty much when divinity matters. Somebody could say, all right, let's say we care for the future of this species, and the future of the species will have a sort of power struggle. Michel Foucault had this idea that it wasn't Michel Foucault, but he had kind of heard it from others, where it was this idea that civilization was another way of power. Just what power is that everything is in a constant state of war. And civilization is kind of like the translation of that world into, let's say, a system that can still be controlled. Right? It's like the animal desire and the savageness of the outer realm through the civilized mind of, let's say, man's ability to fathom law, right? Just like there's, knots in the Eiffel Tower that hold it, there's laws that hold, the structure of a system in civilization. Everything on some level is a system. Right? If we consider it as a beginning. For me, the species should not show symptoms of indecency. Human nature is a natural preservation. It's pretty much like a psychology, a savageness of a savage unconscious psychology slowly over time evolved into like a grateful, conscious psychology. This gratefulness, I think, is the origin of love. I would say even the origin of the idea of love is it's pretty much like a miracle. And the unknown is moving the known. Right now, I am being the known moving the unknown. But before I speak in my inner realms, what is moving my mind is not a concept. Because I can notice the concept. Like there's a distance between, let's say, the inner witness and the ideology, even if one's eyes are closed and they're visualizing it. That means it's like an advanced communicator would be a human being that has found an efficient strategy, let's say, in the outer realms. And then when it comes to your inner realms, it's as if you have found an efficient strategy to how this energy, which is a 4.5 billion year old evolutionary opportunity, right? It's as if you're not just a unique DNA, you're just like, this like capsule of energy, we're like containers of energy. Like, it doesn't get more mysterious than that. Ultimately, consciousness is a response to the content that it finds. Right now, my existence is limited to my sensory perception, my own awareness of my existence. But if I ask myself, after the sensory perception is received, what is that instantaneous force? What is that capital S self rather than the lowercase self, right? That is aware of all the dimensions of my being at the same time. And I have realized that poetically, the love of greater dimensions is the freedom of man's mind from ideology. That means it's like ideology, language, which is replacing truth, being the program, being the code on the matrix screen. Human psychology is a simulation, a subject is moving an object. So it's ultimately like it's like we're being the whole moment, but believing we're just a combination of what's in. Let's say there's an archetype of someone seeking power. this person's ability to seek power is limited to their consciousness. That means it's like true power. When they say knowledge is power, it's another way of saying those who notice more dimensions to the moment, they are pretty much more able because they're seeing more out of the picture. Anyways, I'll put the notepad aside and I'll just continue this. I acknowledge that attention finds itself in an unknown room. The sky doesn't have an edge, and free wills like source can't be found. It's as if like we're invisibly being visible and we don't know how we can use the visible to explain the invisible. And it's as if like it's like the evolution of a visible being. Let's say the transcendence of a visible being into an invisible being, and then an invisible being transcending into an inconceivable being, and then eventually there's a release of individualism in a collective system the moment there's an acceptance of both. It's like a bird has two wings to fly, as the poet Rumi says, and the poet Rumi says the mind also has chaos and order like the wings of a bird to fly and function. Similarly, in the future, human beings will be so advanced that their ability to be an individual objective entity and their ability to be a collective subjective being, it's like it's instant. It's like two wings of a bird. If anybody has questions, like, feel free to share. I don't know, there's a conceivable power which to me is like a conscious strategy, and purpose becomes how you implement its tactics. And then at the same time, there's a love beyond the intellect. It's as if there's a way the world is being so simply and peacefully that before an idea can even be a sort of salvation or savior, it's like there's a freedom before the simulation. It's as if like truth is the only thing that can recognize the simulation. Just the initial consciousness that we are more than our body because a mind is moving it, and we're more than our mind because before we were a mind there was a presence in it. It's like the edges of the mind is like how the whole universe was happening intelligently. We are technically universal beings disguised as human agents, you know? It's very poetic. It's like there's an intelligence beyond here. We don't realize it because all of our belief systems are indivisible. Nobody's been like, I believe in the invisible, man. You know, people are like, okay, man. You know, believing in the invisible is like believing in nothing. But in reality, believing in the invisible is another way of saying there could be another dimension to the whole system. There could be ways the world is happening right now that nobody in 2022 would have the privilege of seeing, but let's say, you know, in 200 years they would have actualized it, right? It's not like the wonders of the world are just in the outer realms. Like, it's just like how the pyramids of Giza and how they point to the Orion belt is fascinating. Is a wonder of the world. Similarly, it's like the pyramids of Giza are like a manifested crop circle, poetically. Three-dimensional crop circle. You know, honestly, the mystery of divinity comes down to why is there anything moving at all? Why are there eyes here to pilot through a realm? And so far my conclusion is that it is activation. We exist to discover the depths of this. Pretty much it's an idea of like, if somebody is truly considering using the word, honoring their intellect, they have to be like, okay, I gotta see what the most advanced stage of my being is before I am like not, let's say, beyond the physical. I feel like reading quotes from Guru Padmasambhava. Let me see. Okay, so this is what I'm going to read for you is like passages from this book that is like, it says a collection of Padmasambhava's advice to the Dakini, Yeshe, Sogyal, and other close disciples. Guru Padmasambhava, let's consider it's his voice. He says, agitation due to circumstances occur when, because of an external incident, you follow a thought, and your mind becomes agitated and scatters into a disturbing emotion. When that happens, keep the attitude of, in quotations, there's no need to do anything. Train in loving kindness and compassion, disenchantment, means, and knowledge and devotion. Following that perseverance in the practice as the time of the view, that will clear it. Pretty much he's saying, if you're looking for the truth, you have to be your true self. To be your true self is like the acknowledgement of, it's like the acknowledgement of the whole thing. Guru Padmasambhava says the root of faults is nothing other than your ego, clinging, the attitude of deluded fixation, so cut the ties of ego clinging. Cast away the fixation on enemy and friend, forsake worldly concerns, abandon materialistic purists, engage in nothing but the Dharma from the core of your heart. Just as a seedling doesn't grow on a stone, there will be no enhancement without removing the fault of ego clinging. You should therefore abandon the root of all evils, ego clinging. And you know what ego clinging is? It's another way of saying your memories do not want to authorize the freedom of your future. It's literally the past it's the past's unfulfilled expectation. If a person let's say they live in a way where they're poetically, it would be as if their mind becomes their ally. And so that means their memories become an ally, their visualizations become an ally. It's another way of saying how their mind moves, assists them. You know, it's as if like you poetically would be as if you become the companion of your presence in an unknown dimension. And so really the journey of consciousness, it has, in yoga they would say, like there's the Raja Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, like these talks of mine, because I'm talking about philosophy. Philosophy is technically the evolution of the yoga of knowledge. And yoga means union, so it's another way of saying you find enlightenment by having ultimate union with the truth through knowledge. You can have it through Bhakti Yoga, which means you use love as a strategy to have an ultimate union with the, let's say, true presence of nature, the original reality. And then there is Karma Yoga, which is the yoga of action. So this is where the concept of the fool is in, right? As if like it's like the search for ideological truth at some point stops, and it's just like becomes a fascination of how beautifully this incredible event is happening in the unknown. So when the unknown becomes your home, you have always, been part of, poetically, the heart of hearts. That means the presence of the universe, is watching over us. Because even if it watches over itself, it's the idea of, like whatever, poetically from a theological standpoint, it would be like whatever God's creation is. It's as if God's creation is looking at God and giving a thumbs up, which is another way of saying, in some sense, we want the greatest for God, so it's as if we have no counter opinion. See, in religion, there's this strange, I would say it's like this very unique tunnel of thought where the person realizes that the moment their free will is not the pure authority of the meaning of the world, that's when the ego realizes submission is the only way. That means it's another way of saying decoding your ethnocentrism to go into the architecture of someone who is in the passenger seat of life and not in the driver's seat. Okay, so it's another way of saying for a religious man, God moves everything. What I'm trying to say is that there's so many different ideological fields. Pretty much every system has had simultaneously a story of meaning behind it, And really, the destiny of the species is like what kind of great story we tell ourselves. And I'm that person in history saying I have a contender. I have this idea that the advanced civilization is the ultimate conclusion of all ideological arguments on this planet. That means we're just going to realize the best option is the best, which means that in order to build an advanced civilization, we need to be advanced. It's like reframing everything, not in the context of its misery, but in the context of its advanced potential. To me, that's like a masterpiece, right? That means it's like, imagine some person draws something on a piece of paper and they're like, oh my god, a masterpiece. Now imagine a human being managed to advance civilization to a point where civilization can self-sustain its advancement. The moment that happens, that's when I would be able to relax. When I just it's like the moment I hear the songs of advanced civilization, I'll most likely retire. Who knows? It may come sooner, it may come later. It may come at a point where human beings become fascinated with a multidimensional view on a human being. We have never been just how the past has, convinced us. It's like let's say in the movie Matrix, someone was like, yo, free your mind, man. It's like this is everybody watching this is waiting for you to free your mind, Neo. And so it's like in that moment, the person, in order to free their mind, has to technically free their mind from all its dimensions. And it's like if their personality is like the outcome of a Tetris game, it's like the whole thing rewinding back into the last Tetris piece. And it's another way of saying it's like the energy of the person that it's like all your energy in this lifetime comes back to all the type of exerted energy of the mind you've had. It's honestly like, like going Super Saiyan, but it's not in the outer realms. It's pretty much the mind realizing its unconditional nature. So it's another way of saying you can move beyond your mind if you can love your mind. Right? It's like that person who could love their enemy, they could defeat the psyche of their enemy. Right? Every moment of life for us to feel like it's a new experience has to be a conscious effort. If it's not a conscious effort, we don't know who's living in the moment, right? It's as if if we right now don't do anything, it's like the world is moving. But if we move, it's like we're moving before the world. So it's another way of saying the free will is playing chess with with different, let's say, with greater dimensions. And it is like trying to stabilize into this recognition that it's ultimately a presence of the whole moment. So it's like the glow of your brain is like the whole moment being the awareness of your mind. And as you're being the whole moment, and as the body is being, and in some sense, as, let's say, the person recognizes like their voice box moving as they're speaking. And if I was to pinpoint exactly where my inner realms connect to the outer realms, is that pretty much I see the film. Like it's as if like my mind is like it's like an invisible viewer of a sub-visible, like subjectively visible event. You know what it is? The mind is an ability to translate life into a film. It's like the mind has the strange ability to copy-paste the sensory perception and then act like it's a creator. It's like the brain is consuming a bit of sensory perception. Or taking in, or let's say getting a bit of sensory perception and then using that sensory perception to mobilize itself before having to physically mobilize. It's literally like our mind is another dimension. Life has been happening this whole time. And eventually when a person reaches their earliest memory, or just, let's say, in any moment, you're like, okay, I think I'm this idea of a person, but wait a minute, where is this idea of a person? And you realize it's in actually the effort. So it's like before I speak, there's nothing there. There's no soul in the body. But the moment I speak, the moment there's effort in the outer realms of movement, it's as if the soul is animated. You know, it's as if like the footprints of the soul were like, you know, worlds, you know, entering worlds. There was this psychologist, I don't remember the exact name of the book or the guy's name, but I just remember I remember reading this book where there was this psychologist who had used this strange but incredible metaphor for the brain and how memories take place. As if imagine somebody who wanted to, this was like, you know, wanting to see how memory moves, you know. To continue, you have one lifetime to discover the nature of your mind. It is the most honorable task, and power is something that gets answered. It's one of those sub-questions that gets answered when a human being begins wondering about their true nature, right? You wonder about how your whole life you have been a viewer of how it's been changing. But you have also been the awareness of that view. It's as if like when God wakes up, you know, poetically every soul was already in paradise. The future generations, they deserve our greatest effort. That's my ultimate conclusion. And I've thought about, okay, what does the power mean when the future has become more important than the present? You know, it's kind of like sometimes I feel like, have I made a mistake, or have I, you know, found the glitch in the system? You know, it's like, have I suddenly noticed that the mind, due to not being an object, has a freedom before the concept of an objective beginning is necessary. It's like the world was being the world before a self was being in the world. So the awareness of the self is simply the awareness of the world. It's as if the person's like, yeah, before I was a human being, I remember being like, part of the planet. It's like 180 degree. It's like my soul was like embodying like 180 degrees of like, like half the sphere of the planet. It's like the poetry of man's mind. It's as if we have been given free will. Is like we're wielding if like free will was a sword and the sword was held in the sky, it would be like a sword glowing with light, Like free will is how advanced the technology of the mind is. If you identify as an object, then your mind has to ignore that you're being a subject right now. So if I ask myself, okay, I'm this podcaster giving this talk and other people are hearing it, but who are other people, right? So it's as if when I have realized there's an unknown viewer looking out through my eyes, right? I have also realized everybody will most likely come to this conclusion. They will come to this realization. This is the mystic's honesty, where we don't fear the unknown. We discover why we're being present there. It's like, why do I exist here? Imagine somebody had such a divine ego where they're like, man, in my past life I was being the Andromeda galaxy. Why am I, being on Earth right now? Giving a podcast. And so it's really the playfulness of man's mind is the reason the world, like this video game, is designed not to make sense, is so that free will has freedom to use the senses. I think, guys, as bizarre as this next statement may sound, I might make this like, the last live stream for now, and probably just upload like previous talks I have, like recorded on my phone. Honestly, guys, I have pressed the record button on the, voice recording app of like, smartphones like so many times. I think I could probably be one of those people in the Guinness Book of Records of like how many times I've pressed this. Imagine like, poetically, humorously, I'm saying, imagine, after this lifetime, I'm some person who goes to a fortune teller, and the fortune teller's like, in your past life, you were someone who would press a red button on a small screen, and then I'd be like, yo, what does that mean? Is that metaphorical? What is that? But poetically, I'll tell you, my own fascination has brought me into a point where the free will has an ability to play with infinity. And after it plays with infinity for a little while, it will come to realize that life is ultimately like you settle into its presence. Right? And for some reason, because right now, Civilization 1.0, right now, it appears to me the future generations, it's becoming easier for them to be dishonest, as if like they haven't realized the value of what an advanced orchestrated human movement would look like, right? We have seen examples of individual suffering, and individual victory, and now we have seen the example of individual suffering. We have not seen the example of collective victory. That's it. It's like we've reached that point in history where a global event requires to happen. And so this global event can occur in accordance to just the story of humankind resetting. But it's resetting through, I would say, a benevolent context. That means it's like, how did human civilization, advance beyond war in the future? Right? And so the future generations will ask this, from the future, that means the future of the future will ask this from our future, And it's as if there is nothing else for the mind to do. The mind either moves and is a soul, or in some sense doesn't move and is the universe whole. WHOLE. For me, I am thinking, like, for how long is the species going to psychologically suffer because of, like, the inefficient story it's telling itself? What if there was a way to look at the human being that was the true advanced value? That means imagine every person on this planet would entertain the spectrum of duality, where they were valuing reality as if, like, okay, this is the chaotic meaning, this is the ordered meaning. Imagine an advanced being so advanced that it doesn't even need the concept of advancement. It is the pure activation of it. It's ultimately an energetic effort. We are literally like, if the universe was playing an instrument, humanity is the melody. The rise and fall of civilizations. It's like the various songs, it's like the songs in the playlist of the cosmos, And we're so blessed to be in a civilization where we have an emotional freedom, because that's what happened, right? When we gave people freedom of speech, we also gave them an ability to be free to express themselves. And then if you can express yourself in a free place, technically the world is free in that moment, right? Somebody could say, I want world peace, and it's like, sure, if you want just a snapshot of world peace, you could just go into a peaceful moment and for a second consider, okay, everything's peaceful, world peace. Or the person can be like, all right, it's literally like an incredible chess game and an opportunity of every person having a role on this chessboard, because the expectation the species has of itself, that's the evolution of power. No longer power is the ego showing it has power. That's not, it's like the powerful don't show power. Why? Because it's a field-like nature. This is what the Buddha was trying to tell his disciples, and the disciples of Buddha were like, Buddha, you're an enlightened guy, we're all worshiping, right? It's like, what greater enlightenment can there be than that, And Buddha's like, buddy, I'm not a Buddha, it's a Buddhic nature. And you notice it, you ease into how your soul has been here the whole time, how your presence has been universal. And your eyes can associate with a chunk of land, they can associate with a chunk of sound. They can associate with a chunk of image and color, but you'll realize you are a universal being. Or are we kidding? Are we lying to ourselves? It's like the human event is happening in a universe, inside a universal event. And so if the universe is intelligent, pretty much it's this hilarious idea at the moment. It's like this was kind of one of the unique advantages of religion, that the moment the concept of God came into the picture, the ego now had a new desire. right? Imagine like back in the day, the ego of the desire was just like cruelty, and then suddenly when God came, then suddenly the archetype of cruelty wanted to see itself as God, right? If from a theological perspective, I was sharing in one of the talks where the concept of the fallen angel is this idea that the angel couldn't accept what was happening, so it had to change the world. Right? It's as if like you're every person's left in this moment where they're like, okay, do I accept the world or do I change? Like, it's like, how should I say it? It's as if like an angel couldn't accept God, even though angels are the will of God. This is the clue in theology. It was as if it's like, if you're not free of yourself, you try to, like, it's like the ego's destiny is the outcome, and the ego's destiny is like, oh no, I wasn't in harmony. But in reality is that I'm saying every human being, there's this quote from, I don't know who says, I think it's George Baton, S. Baton. He says that, hopefully I'm not getting the name wrong, but he says, you must serve before you can command. And the ancient sages would say the mind is a lousy master but a great servant. It's another way of saying it's like you have to find an allegiance with your own being. And then that's when honesty becomes second nature, and every moment becomes like, it's like, this is the power of decency, I find. That it's as if you are in the original earth, and then everything happens, its karma has to filter through that. Right? It's as if like, with a simple conscious effort, an advanced being can be found in an advanced realm. Back in the day, there were generals who would have armies and they would have to defend their kingdoms. And right now, in my mind, poetically, I see it as if this is the species to me is the kingdom of humanity. It's a kingdom. And what to me is the God, is the king of this kingdom, is the future. If somebody says, Mr. Within, do you serve a king? And I'll be like, yes. And they'll be like, who's this king? And I'll be like, the king is the inconceivable future, which is another way of saying the original divinity. You see, to me, power for the body, it's most likely mobility, desire for mobility. Power for the mind is freedom of vision. Right? So it's not just like understanding, but what happens to the understanding? If understanding was like throwing the wood into the fire, it's like how the wood burns is poetically like how in some sense free will responds to its reception of perception. Before I end off, I'm just going to read a bunch of quotes about power, like going to a quote tunnel. Lao Tzu says, mastering others is strength. Mastering yourself is true power. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Power is given only to those who dare to lower themselves and pick it up. Only one thing matters, one thing, to be able to dare. That means an evolutionary conscious effort should feel worthy of its attempt. Leonardo da Vinci says nothing strengthens authority so much as silence. Bruce Lee says knowledge will give you power, but character respect. Frederick the Great says a crown is merely a hat that lets the rain in. Friedrich Nietzsche says all things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. Exactly, and that power is unknown. That's why it's power, right? You could say power is like truth's glow from, like a, let's say, divine context. Like, which is another way of saying, like, there's an inconceivable administration to the conceivable moderation of matter as free will. Mark Twain says clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no influence on society. Edmund Burke says the greater the power, the more dangerous the abuse. Eleanor Roosevelt says never allow a person to tell you no who doesn't have the power to say yes. Frederick Douglass says power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. William Gaddis says power doesn't corrupt people, people corrupt power. Charles de Gaulle says silence is the ultimate weapon of power. Lucius Annaeus Seneca says most powerful is he who has himself in his own power. What an incredible quote. That's it. It's another way of saying, why do we have a 4.5 billion year old evolutionary capability to use consciousness? It's just like this genetical pattern on this earth, and then to me it's as if, like, just like bees seek pollen and then they aim to build a beehive. I feel like the human mind should be seeking new dimensions of perception and trying to build an advanced civilization. That means there is no one ideological truth, because in a multidimensional realm, that ideological truth can have infinite parallel universes of happening. It's another way of saying, what is the meaning of infinity? The person's like, okay, I got it, existence, like the meaning of existence, like I'm trying to figure that out, and suddenly what's the meaning of infinity? Infinite existence. The person at some point will be like, all right, infinity has nowhere to go. And so the ultimate freedom is beyond conception, right? That means it's as if, like, the invisible suffering is released through an inconceivable knowing. And in some sense, it's like such ananda is another way of saying when your mind, your inner realms and outer realms are there's no longer a within or without anymore. It's another way of saying you were a free being before you did anything. Who knew freedom was here before we were? That's the freedom of, I would say, nature, right? Like right now, I feel like I'm just like there's flowers in the garden, it's like there's birds in the sky and there's podcasters on balconies. Pretty much, we need a better story for the species to tell itself. And the ultimatum of power is that the most powerful beings, they don't need power, they don't need control, they need efficiency. That means in Buddhism, the Bodhisattva archetype is another way of saying if the person in their past life had become a Buddha, they had found individual freedom. They had found self-realization, self-enlightenment. But the bodhisattva is poetically like as if a being where it's like individually it's free, but collectively until the world is free, it becomes free. It's like honor to the ultimate conclusion of reality. It's like the wonder of like what did the bodhisattvas see, you know, in the future of the earth. And what it is that the freedom of all of us is the greatest freedom of one of us. That means our greatest freedom is the whole system's freedom. You know, in Mr.Within's school of thought, let's say, I have this idea, I call it that the reason I use the term we're advanced communicators is because we're the most advanced communication of this part of the universal system. We are like the brightest eyes in the, you know, this part of the cosmos. We are the most advanced communication of this universal sector. So when we have that sort of honor, so existentially, it's like, you know, the spirit of the world moves through all of us. Experientially, poetically, the unknown soul journeys through a noble world and beyond. How will the species wield power? It would wield it with laughter. It would wield it with the most advanced insight, you know. That means in the future, you know, the world's going to turn. Right now we're in like the misery mode of it, but in the future it's going to reach a point where every day is going to be a celebration, because every day something's advancing. And it's part of the honor of everybody's effort. You know, it's like the scientist was like, you know, it's like, you know, the state wants me to vote, but it's like we believe in the butterfly effect, like, you know. I think an incredibly advanced being would be so advanced that it would be smart enough and intelligent enough to find a way of creating a system. Let's say, I'm trying to say pretty much like it's totally possible that there is an incredible, just like a sequence of chess moves the species can make to build an incredibly advanced civilization, right? It's like that's the brilliance of consciousness. And when consciousness works together, it's as if 8 billion musicians playing like their DNA, like, you know. And so it's like all that sound, all that life kind of being part of, you know, the bigger picture. There's this quote from Alice Walker: the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. I don't know if I had read that. It's honestly presence, right? And the dimensions of, in what dimensions your own intelligence arrives, right? I think, you know, a person, you know, can get a sketchbook, specifically like a sketchbook, and they could sit in a room and in 2 hours, you know, revolutionize their own consciousness up to this point in their life. It's pretty much another way of saying before a story shapes the value system, there's an unknown viewer looking ultimately at an unknown world at the edge of meaning. So what I'm trying to say is that we are creatures that have memory, but the brain is simulating itself, re-simulating itself. It's pretty much like the ego. Every time we blink, the ego's like, oh my god, where did the world go? And then suddenly we open our eyes, right? That means it's another way of saying our blinking is another way of saying visually the world is resetting all the time. The brain has to acknowledge that gap. Life is brilliant, and I don't know, I feel the whole thing can be happening in a more advanced way. I'm trying to make an effort, and I call it Civilization 2.0. And I feel that the greatest inspiration is an ultimatum in reach. It's another way of saying, what is the best thing we can do to get the whole species united, because there's greater challenges ahead, and pretty much we need all human beings on the planet as a sort of like, part of their upbringing, in the back of their mind being like, okay, it's like there's an honor to how civilization has continued so far, right? And it's like, what does it truly deserve? Our inner realms can see like, a greater world, even though in front of our eyes we may not see one. Like, that's the power, that's the grand power of the mind. It brings forth the possibility of the future before the past solidifies the moment, like anyways, this talk has gone long enough. Thanks for listening, and the resolutions for future generations would be that we went as far as we could, and so should you. Like that would be the thing, where we live for the future and the future lives for the future, and this algorithm becomes like the true crown of history being passed down consciously. Our lives are as valuable as where we find them in. Our eyes can, behind our eyes, like, any sort of subcontext of, let's say, inner realm perception can be presented. Pretty much it's like the person's like, alright, I noticed I'm not an object, and I noticed I'm not a subject, and so what now? And that's where silence and abidance comes in. And so pretty much you could say the most advanced state of being is the state of being that trusts the greatness of the world before even a self can be tempted. That is true victory, a victory from the beginning. That means that's like the kind of victory of, I would say, this Mr.Within talks. Like Mr. Within's victory would be how the species realized its most advanced effort could bypass unnecessary suffering. Like, what I'm trying to say is, like, we can bypass extinction by having a responsibility as a species to acknowledge for the first time the multidimensional human being. Imagine like a child comes home, after school, and the parents looks at the child at the dinner table, and the child is quiet, for example, right? And so imagine in an advanced civilization, the parent would be like, okay, it would be like, hey child, how was your day? And the child would say it was okay, and be very quiet, right? And so then the parent would say to the child, okay, now tell me what's going on in your inner worlds, And it's another way of saying, how are we looking at life? It all comes down to this. Our freedom, is in this. The person's like, I'm suffering, and the person's like, oh, no worries, man, just change how you're looking at it. They tell the person, how did you get enlightened? It's like, yeah, I just realized, I can't be. That freedom doesn't have a personality. We have the incredible privilege as an organism in the void to experience not just an existential event, not just a psychological, subjective, and experiential event. It's like beyond the life of our body, and beyond the films of our mind, and beyond the stillness of our eternal eyes. All the other lokas were happening inside Brahma Loka. It's as if truth was looking for truth just to realize its being. That would be an example of an advanced archetype in an advanced civilization. Imagine, right? Imagine like the bedtime stories for the children in the future would be like, building an advanced civilization, all the possible dimensions to the mind, right? People don't realize the value of science fiction. It's going to be one of the biggest forces that's going to wake up the species. The world more than ever needs science fiction writers, and those who are staring at the geometry of the technological dimension of life. I already know cyberspace has probably in 200 years from now, we're going to be like cyber beings too. Consciousness is going to be divided between a cyber life and inner realm ideological life and the physical life. So technology is going to make us a triangular entity. When I say triangular entity, I mean a trio, like three-dimensional entity. Right now, the idea of being a person in a world is a two-dimensional entity. There's a self and the world contrast. Right? The concept of everything being God, that's a singular dimension of an identity. Right? It's pretty much how is attention identifying. Right? And I realized the mystics were too cool for like the cultural school. Pretty much. They had an ability to be like, okay, before my mind started painting over the world, where was the brush? And that's when a person meets their free will for the first time, by realizing that's the ability, instantaneous ability of being a conscious entity. It's like there's a sphere around us and we don't realize. This sphere is the whole moment. I have been in settings, right, where I would say you could call me an honest fool, where I have just trusted my intuition, not even an ideological analysis. That means a rationalist would be like, man, that's unreasonable. And I'd be like, it's just the feeling commands beyond the ideological interpretation. And I've just been sitting somewhere and I've just had this feeling like if there was an orb around me, that orb just moved outside of the room I was in and I just got up and left. I just felt like my moment was going somewhere else, right? Before my mind could have a sort of, ideological expectation. It's as if before before the future arrives, it's as if we meet it. That's how it happens. And so power in the outer realms should be used to serve the species, pretty much. We've reached that point in the human species where, it's like nature's wilderness was kind of like every creature for itself, and the civility of the human mind is to be like, wait a minute, for the first time, a species can consciously walk towards the future. Just the power, guys. I don't know, there's some moments where I feel like, it's like the cosmos, origin of the cosmos is roaring, and it's like all celestial phenomena is bowing. It's like the world is an inconceivable freedom beyond conceivable despair. And it's like fears were meant to be understood rather than possessed. If somebody says, Mr. Within, have you seen somebody who's been possessed? And I'll be like, yes, I've seen an angry person. For example, an angry person is possessed by the past. There could be that if somebody is emotionally possessed by the future, right? They could be very cruel to the present, which that is something that needs to be in check also. And I don't know, I'm just trying to get a species into this kind of massive, giant research project called What Do We Do with 8 billion creatures on a sphere? Like, this should be the universal homework, right? If there's a child in a country where there's suffering, poverty, and that child gets out of that conditions and has a new life, and that child's like, all right, what now in this new life, in this new world? It would be to try to solve the biggest problems. That means it's as if, like, a person should expect that, the future generations will have not just the audacity, they will have the innate knowing of how greatness comes with how we responded to our lifetime, what we did while we were here. And we can serve physically the realm. A person can just, let's say, dance your whole life and think like that's the meaning of life. But you can also have this view that it's like the rare point, it's like a rare video game, right? Where when we wake up in the day, we log into the conscious, like, waking awareness of manifestation. And so it's as if at some point the person's like, okay, the bird tried to fly, and mid-flight discovered it was the sky, and the sky didn't need to fly anymore. It's another way of saying the soul was never a soul when the whole moment is alive. What greater ideology can you need from the experiential knowing that we are living in the unknown? We are the living unknown. I think that's an incredible definition of the psychology of man's mind. The living unknown. The person's like, I didn't want to be a philosopher, but because nobody, the species, had no clue what it was, I had to. Anyways, guys, my ultimate thing is I gotta read this quote for you. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's from Hagakure, Book of the Samurai. So this quote is like samurai level honor level. Okay. There's a quote in the Book of the Samurai where this quote is just a bunch of words, and this is the sequence that Yamamoto Tsunetomo is saying this. So, Hagakure, the Book of the Samurai. Respect, honesty, courage, rectitude, loyalty, honor, benevolence. Like, these are like the levels of this video game of life, right? First, the species has to respect each other. Everybody has to respect. Respect means we respect the potential. That means it's like, this is like our kind of like backup system to cruelty, right? Where it's as if we're like, okay, like, as much as there's a rationality for external cruelty, it's like the person's potential means like there's a hidden greatness to every moment, pretty much. That means it's like you cannot measure intelligence in a changing world, but you can, in some sense, realize that if there is intelligence, it's working in accordance to its scope. It's, to me, I feel just like warriors had to, discover their abilities in battle. Similarly, the battle of modernity is for people to realize what is the exact setting that the human scenario is taking place. And the moment they realize it's unknown, and we still don't know, like, there's a hard problem to consciousness. There's mysteries of, we don't know how to explain the instantaneous, But anyways, back to this quote. A species that respects itself. A species that is purely honest. That means nobody needs to be dishonest, because honesty is like cooler than dishonesty. Why? Because honesty is like living in the original earth. You know, dishonesty is like you know, midway of living in one world, you simulated another one and entered that. It's a fragmented karma, you know. But anyways, a species that respects itself, a species that is honest with itself, a species that is courageous. That means it's like we're not like you know, ignorant warrior species. We are in some sense a kind of conscious commander species. Every brain in this universal sector is like a commander of a certain range of manifestation. You know, we are like incredible inventions of the universe. So eventually, let's say we have loyalty, honor, and we come to benevolence. So let's say the species has, for me, the idea of the advanced civilization is what solves this part of where there's honor, you know. And the concept of benevolence. Benevolence is like the most royal thing to me. I don't know why, but I feel benevolence is the expression of an advanced being. Why? Because the advanced being is beyond like change. On some level, the person's like, you know, the world is here to see itself, you know, not to, in some sense, you know, ignore the glory of this. Right, like the person's like waking up in a world, you know, it's like, okay, we created the meaning, but at the same time there has to be like some hidden glory to this, right? So what are we doing here? And for me, the answer came to that: to build a civilization so advanced that it can be benevolent. That means the species was so smart, it built the most ultimate thing. But anyways, guys, thanks for listening, and you know, this was a long episode. Much blessings and namaste. And how will the species wield power? Beautifully. Namaste.